In this lecture, we're going to cover the NCAA as a cartel. We're going to start by defining what a cartel is, discussing how cartels work, and then looking at the case for the NCAA as a cartel. So first, what is a cartel? A cartel is when firms collude to achieve monopoly-like power by coordinating their prices and competitive behavior. So these firms have a profit motive and they realize we can band together and then we can keep our prices high and we can limit the amount of competitive behaviors that we would be engaged in. So I'm not trying to steal your customers, you're not trying to steal mine. Now, what's interesting about this, obviously, is that cartels are often discussed in a way where government intervention is needed. But what we often observe is the same profit motive that brings cartels together also breaks them up, also undermines them, because there's that profit motive to cheat, if you will, on the cartel. So cartels have sort of 5 classic activities. They coordinate what they do and how they compete. They fix prices. They assign outputs to different groups in the cartel. They divide up the profits, and they prevent new competitors from coming into the market. So how is it that a cartel works? Well, George Stigler says there are basically 2 conditions. 1, reaching a consensus on the terms of coordination, and 2, establishing a system to detect and punish cheating against the terms of coordination. So let's go through the first. Sometimes reaching a consensus on terms of coordination is an explicit agreement on coordinating prices. Some of the cartels that you would have heard of, OPEC, for example, would do this kind of thing. Sometimes that comes in the form of an unwritten understanding that we need to limit competition. And so what happens in that case is we don't really meet, we don't say, there's no evidence, if you will, but maybe behind the scenes or just in general, we're not going to fix prices, but I'm not really going to be cutthroat. You're not going to be cutthroat against me. That's cartel behavior. And then, of course, sort of the least explicit version is just the mutual recognition that all firms would be better off if they limit the amount that they compete with each other. Once you've got that established, you have to keep it, right? Because at any point, somebody lowers the prices, runs an ad campaign attacking you very fiercely, the cartels can break down very quickly. Okay. One of the things that we see often happen is threats from entry. So we'll see firms coming from the outside of the current cartel, and they'll engage in trying to get into the market. Classic example of this is ocean shipping, oil, railroads, where you had a cartel, new competitors come along and sort of break it up. And this is what I meant earlier in this class when I said, remember, markets are a sort of discipline, right? So because there's a market, even though we have bad behavior, cartel behavior, cheating, collusion, price fixing, because there's a profit there, there's an incentive for people to break in and try to get a portion of that profit. So the market has its own regulating force and regulating power. Okay. The other type is from internal cheating, where there's a member in the group and they want to lower the prices in order to steal customers, steal market share, and get more profit. We see examples of this in electric turbines and railroad transport. So some really classic keys there. The other half of this, right, is punishment. And the punishment is other members often, try to target price discounts. So everybody else that's in the cartel tries to steal back your customers by temporarily lowering their prices to put you out of business. They can also, remember, we're setting some of the output. And so we'll actually see the punishment of you're not allowed to make more, we're cutting back on your quotas. So if it doesn't work, you're going to be out of business. So you sort of sink or swim sort of situation. And then finally, suspending the cartel for a bit, allowing everybody to compete, and then coming back together. The problem with punishments and cartels is all the punishments also hurt the cartel and all the members involved. So if there's any kind of cheating, in order to stop it, everybody takes a hit in the interim. Okay, so now we've got an idea what a cartel is. let's look at the case for the NCAA being a cartel. I'm going to come with uh, basically 6 points and then sort of a summary conclusion, the bottom line, if you will. So the points of evidence here are going to be restricting pay of players, restricting pay of coaches, some other rules that sort of limit different aspects of member institutions in the cartel. Then, of course, head coaches and rents. So remember, rents, we've introduced this idea before in the class, right? It's a profit that is earned through non-competitive behavior, right? So getting a profit because of a law prevents competitors. Limits on output, another very classic cartel behavior, and then, of course, preventing new entrants. And then I'm going to wrap up by talking about what the effects are. A lot of this is pulled from a paper by Lawrence Kahn in the Journal of Economic Perspectives from 2007 called Cartel Behavior and Amateurism in College Sports. Okay, so cartel behavior and amateurism in college sports. Let's start with just kind of setting the table, right? This is big business. The revenues involved here are very large. College football and college basketball are near pro level revenues, right? In 1999, total ticket revenues were $760 million. Broadcast revenues for the NCAA tournament alone, not the whole season, it's actually greater than Major League Baseball. Remember, that's like 6 weeks of basketball tops, and it's March Madness. It's $564 million in revenues in 2005. And of course, this is less than the NFL, which is an enormous $2 billion in revenue in 2005. Now, the difference is pro teams feature highly paid athletes, and they're owned by investment groups or wealthy owners. College teams, on the other hand, are owned by universities, and the athletes are, until recently, unpaid. So at the time of this article, they were unpaid, basically, but they're still relatively low paid compared to professional athletes, especially non-stars. This, of course, leads to a very specific problem, which is how do you balance large revenues and then what we would call the university mission, right? So the university is not necessarily a profit maximizing, right? They have other goals that are related to education. How do you balance that with really large profitability in this case? So let's take a look just sort of broadly the NCAA as a cartel. So the NCAA started in response to safety and amateur status concerns in football. So back in 1950, they had 387 members. As of 2006, they had 1,000 members, so they've seen a lot of growth. But there's actually some very high-profile deaths from playing college football, and the NCAA was primarily formed to regulate that and to keep players from getting injured or in several terrible cases, actually getting killed playing football early on. Now, there's actually in economics what we call the cartel theory of the NCAA. There are several good economists who work in this area that argue the way to explain, right? If you look at the NCAA and say what organization structure do they behave like, the answer is a cartel. Okay, and there's 3 main reasons that economists argue that. The first is enforced collective restrictions on payments to factors of production, right? So we limit our cost by limiting the amount that factors of production can be paid. In this case, that's player compensation, recruiting expenses, and assistant coach salary are the main 3. Then the other 3 elements of the cartel theory is that they restrict output, and of course they defeat rival entrants, which, if you remember on how cartels work, you can see how those are correlated to cartel behavior. So let's start with restricting player pay. So the roots of limits on player compensation go back to the early era of college football, 1920 to 1950. And we actually see in the 1940s is when players really began to get paid to play college football, and we see this sort of real popularity spike in football and college football. So if we're going to argue that the NCAA is restricting the pay of college athletes, we have to argue that those athletes are indeed underpaid. Or you could say, well, a scholarship, that's actually a market outcome, and so they're not restricting the pay if they're being paid the right amount. Okay, so there's two ways that economists argue that the player pay is restricted, and really we could add a third based on sort of observed NIL payments, right? But one of the first ways that economists did this is through a sophisticated estimating. So they took university revenue from the sports and they explained it. They wrote models that then explained it by the number of players that are eventually drafted. How does this work? This works because that helps us estimate the marginal revenue product of draft quality players. So what that means is how much revenue did players produce if they were of sufficient quality to go on and get drafted, because then we can tell how much those players are worth because there's a market in the NFL and we can observe what their first contract is. What they found was college football players who made it to the draft were producing almost $500,000 in revenue for their universities, where college basketball players were producing, if they're good enough to go to the draft, producing $1.4 million for the university. Given that players were not making those kind of numbers, there's evidence then that there's restriction on the pay of players. So until 2021, when name, image, likeness came along, players could only receive scholarships for tuition, fees, room, and board, and so their compensation was limited to about $40K per year, and that's for a private school, so that's the absolute upper end, right? So if you go to a public institution, you're going to have lower value of those things: tuition, fees, room, and board. And so that $40K is not even an order of magnitude of the kind of revenues that these players are bringing in to their universities. Of course, the other piece of evidence is if these players were being paid sufficiently, there wouldn't be any need for under-the-table payments, which of course is a staple of high-end, probably all levels, but especially high-end college athletics. The evidence that Kahn presents in his paper is a survey that shows 31% of surveyed NFL players admitted to receiving payments while they were in college, and 48% of them claimed that they knew other people who received payments when they were in college. So between these three arguments, right, we could actually add this one in here, right? So name, image, likeness, payments, right? Because those in the recent years when we've seen those paid out, because those have been so high, that shows that there's a big gap between what players were paid and what they could make on the market once it became somewhat legal, right? Okay, so there are a few counter arguments on restricting the pay of players, and these are the ones that Kahn lays out here. So let's work through them. So one counter argument is, well, yes, but then some college athletes, they get into schools they wouldn't otherwise. So it's not really just $40K in tuition. It's also the opportunity to go to a university they wouldn't have otherwise gotten into. And that, of course, is not necessarily, it's not without merit, but it does have, I think, limitations in its value because many of these athletes don't end up graduating, especially draft eligible ones, which would be the ones that would be the evidence for restricting pay. Another is that competition for athletes is potentially wasteful to society. So if you pay players to play college athletics, that this is a waste of resources. The university could use the money in other ways. That depends on how you view the way that the university is distributing its money, right? Because if it's extremely valuable to people to field a good football team, then it's difficult to argue that that's a waste to society, as much as it is nice and high-minded to say that we would actually value more being able to, put those university funds somewhere else. Okay, third, labor supply of college athletes is very or perfectly inelastic. The upshot of this idea is basically if the players would be doing it, doing this particular activity for less, then raising the money that they would be getting won't change the number of athletes that come to play college football. And there's two obvious reasons for that. One is players wanting to play college football, and so they'll do it even if they don't get paid, which we obviously saw, right? And two, uh, many of these players are not really playing for the college football money; they're playing for the eventual NFL money. And so one of the, I'd say probably this is the best argument that's like, is pay really restricted if you change the amount that they can get paid and the number of players desiring to go play college football doesn't change? Now, do we know that's the case? We don't. So maybe there's a big jump there. Seems very doubtful. Okay. Fourth argument here is the spirit of amateurism. So college sports is different than professional sports because we sort of appreciate why these players are playing. And if we value watching amateur sport, then by paying them, well, they're no longer amateurs. I think at the end of the day, we got to remember that if you're making money off of somebody else's work, in this case, the name, image, and likeness and performance on the field of college athletes, I think a spirit of amateurism argument is extremely weak argument to say, well, these people shouldn't get paid for their efforts just because we like watching amateur sports. So we should pretend that this is amateur sport and take advantage of these college athletes. That's a pretty silly argument. Okay, and then maybe another one of the, I'll say, halfway decent arguments is lifetime permanent income is very high for elite players. So the players that would make the money under the system that would allow them to be paid um, is elite players. Those elite players are going to go on to play professional sports most of the time, short of having really unfortunate career-ending kind of injuries. And so, you might be talking about a drop in the bucket, which is probably true, but probably doesn't qualify as a good ethical argument. Okay, the other way that NCAA limited uh, input cost factor payments is on assistant coach pay. So 1991, prior to 1991, or no, excuse me, in 1991, the NCAA tried to set a maximum compensation for assistant coaches of $12,000 during the season and $4,000 during summer pay. They end up being sued in an antitrust suit, which is won by the assistant coaches, and they end up they win $67 million. The NCAA appeals, and in the interim, they end up settling for $55 million. So pretty strong evidence that that NCAA is sort of engaged in anti-competitive behaviors there. Now, there's several other important rules that kind of limit the cost and limit the payments to factor production in the NCAA. One is age limits. So both the NBA and the NFL have eligibility rules. The NBA, you have to be 19 and be a year removed from high school. NFL, you have to be 3 years removed from high school. So that's why we see players going to the draft when they end up going to the draft. And of course, these reduce the elasticity of supply because you're putting players in a situation where they can't just go straight from high school into the pros. And so they have fewer options. So they're less sensitive to price. And by price, I mean the payments that they would receive to play college athletics. The next is roster sizes, right? So the NCAA limits both scholarships and roster sizes. This naturally reduces cost, right? Because you're having to fund those scholarships. And then, of course, historically, the NCAA dramatically reduced player mobility, right? So you don't have as much competition. You don't have these players potentially getting paid as much as they could get paid if you can't transfer from school to school. And of course, post 2020, these rules have been dramatically relaxed, and so we're kind of in a different era in that regard. Okay. Now, what's really interesting about this is head coaching pay is kind of an unclear whether it's hurt or helped by NCAA cartel behavior, because on one hand, you'd think a cartel would want to limit head coaching pay just like they would want to limit everything else, right? And they've actually tried to limit assistant coaching pay, so why wouldn't they want to limit head coaching pay? And then, of course, by limiting their output, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that actually should reduce the demand for coaching. If you're coaching more games and more high-profile things, then the demand for a good coach is going to go up. But on the other hand, there's actually some ways in which the NCAA choices have actually helped, and by helped I mean raise head coaching pay. And the the most important and most obvious way that we see this is the NCAA limiting player compensation. That's actually going to benefit coaching pay by raising the marginal revenue product of coaches. So if I have a bunch of money to spend and the players on the field I can only compete with to a certain level, right? I can only spend so much on that. Then the next best way to put a better team on the field is to get a better coach. And that's why we see um, college coaching pay very similar to professional coaching pay. Okay, so maybe the most glaring thing is limits on outputs, right? And this is maybe the most quintessential thing that cartels do. As we talked about with monopoly behavior back in that lecture, you reduce the amount of output so that you can raise the prices so that you can profit, right? So before 1984, the NCAA actually limited TV access to its members. Well, in 1977, during this time period, there developed a college football association, which tried on its own to negotiate a separate deal with NBC to sort of break up the power that the NCAA had over the TV deal. The NCAA responded by threatening to expel any university that signed on with this deal with NBC and the College Football Association. University of Oklahoma and the University of Georgia end up suing, and that then leads to the end of the NCAA control and broadcasting rights in 1984 with the NCAA versus Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma when the Supreme Court ruled in Oklahoma's favor. Of course, long term, since then, TV coverage has exploded, and it's essentially impossible for the NCAA to go about limiting output in that particular way. And then, of course, there's lots of other ways that the NCAA limit output, game schedule, number of bowls, etc. Okay, and then of course finally, right? So limiting factor payments, limiting output, and then preventing new entrants or fighting off rivals. And there's three very high-profile instances of this, and that is the first one is initially the NCAA did not organize intercollegiate athletics for women, right? So it was designed around men's football and then, of course, quickly took on men's basketball. Well, in 1971, the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women formed, basically trying to be the same thing as the NCAA, but for women's sports. The NCAA sort of headed that off by adding women's sports to their scheduling in 1980. And I believe the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women actually had quite a bit of success in the early years, which then developed the programs that the NCAA then began to schedule for. So as there became more women's sports in college, and of course this is important, right? Because it's the intercollegiate that matters. So it's not the sports within the university; it's the sports where different universities are playing against each other. Probably the most high-profile one was the National Invitational Tournament, which you might have heard of. That's the NIT. And this was a rival college basketball tournament and was at the time actually the more prestigious of the two tournaments. It was the tournament. However, in 1960, the NCAA tried to require members to prioritize their tournament. They end up getting sued, antitrust suit, a common theme we're seeing here. The NCAA then bought out the NIT, and so while the NIT still lives on today as the lesser tournament, it's actually owned by the NCAA. It's not a separate organization. And at the time, right, $40 million, quite a big sum of money. And then maybe the least compelling example is the history of the Bowl Championship Series, where the NCAA installed a bunch of Division I group requirements. In order to be Division 1A, you had to have a minimum sport program, a number of sports programs, a minimum number of scholarships, and a minimum number of fan attendance. Right. So remember what we're doing here. We're trying to prevent firms, schools in this case, from outside the cartel from being able to compete. And so by making a high-profile bowl championship series and then excluding universities from that, right, you're giving cartel power to the teams, the universities that are meeting these requirements. Okay, so what's the upshot of all this and what are the financial effects of it? Well, The first question then is just, do university athletic programs end up turning a profit? Well, the revenue per Division 1A school program as of 2003 is that football programs bring in almost 13 million and basketball programs bring in over 4 million in revenue per year. Combined, this turns a profit on just those two programs of about $8 million per school in the Division 1A programs. The In general, though, other programs do not profit. Hockey is maybe a small profit, but basically every other program loses money. And so the consequence then is the financial effect of the NCAA acting as a cartel is that the average Division 1A athletic program, that means all of their sports, actually loses $600,000 a year on a $27 million per year budget for college athletics at that university.